Hello and welcome to Global Review. I am Sachin Chaturvedi. We bring to you weekly analysis of key global developments. As always, let's have a look at the headlines. EU launched new initiative to trade with Iran, calls it in stacks. EU-Japan trade deal is the largest bilateral FTA, includes 28% of world GDP. Central African Republic reaches out peace deal to end in 5 years of violence. Sri Lanka to sign a concessional loan agreement with China of $1 billion. United States to withdraw from Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. Russia fears arms race. Crisis deepens in Venezuela. Ethical issues of neural privacy threatened as researchers develop mind-reading technology. Climate change worsens. Australia faces hottest month and US hit by polar vortex. Today we have picked up a very interesting issue in our detailed analysis, where we would be bringing to you the situation in Afghanistan in our section Across the Globe. With US-Taliban talks, the whole context of US withdrawal and its imperatives for the region has deepened. Lot of commentaries are coming in, people are coming up with different perceptions. Let's have a look at this report.
The United States and Taliban have agreed in principle to a peace framework to bring an end to the 18-year-long war in Afghanistan. The peace framework entails the withdrawal of US forces in exchange of commitment from Taliban to prevent Afghanistan becoming a safe haven for terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In 2018, Taliban launched an offensive to gain leverage over the ruling government and attacked the Afghan forces. A New York Times report points to the attacks resulting in nearly 30 deaths a day. The peace talks come in the backdrop of increasing violence by Taliban. The talks have been initiated by US and currently not backed by the Afghan government. Any deal between US and Taliban would, however, require support from the ruling party. Russia too has also stepped in, pushing talks in Moscow between Afghan opposition leaders, including former President Hamid Karzai and Taliban. India asserts that any deal between the US and Taliban should safeguard the constitutional structure of Afghanistan and not establish an interim government that can lead to regional instability following a US withdrawal. Recent developments in Afghanistan create a space for India-China cooperation to take forward the Wuhan spirit and ensure regional security. At the upcoming Russia, China and India foreign ministers meet in Shanghai later this month, developments in Afghanistan will be on the agenda. Under the Obama administration, the US pulled out NATO combat troops from Afghanistan in 2014. However, around 14,000 American troops remain in Afghanistan and have been providing training and counter-terrorism support to Afghan forces. The next round of US-Taliban peace talks are scheduled for February 25 in Qatar.
So what are the key components of this proposed peace framework that US is discussing with Taliban? How it is going to influence the working of China and India in Afghanistan, and how Russia is going to view this? These are some very intricate issues, and we are joined in the studios today by two very eminent commentators. We have Dr. Harsh Pant from ORF, and we are also joined in by Professor Sreeram Chaulia from Jindal University. Harsh, let me start with you first. Why you see this growing eagerness in US to come out and fix Taliban in some format as credible partner, start the talks and give them the responsibility? What do you think is triggering this whole exercise?
Well, it seems to be driven by the domestic political calculus of Mr. Trump, but let us also remember that a number of times this issue has been on the table. Even Mr. Obama's time, there was a lot of discussion about withdrawal, and as we know, he did withdraw NATO troops from the region. So now from Afghanistan. So now we have basically American 14,000 troops there. and there has been some pressure on Mr. Trump to deliver, because he came to power saying that he would wind up these two major wars, one in Syria and one in Afghanistan. Now in Syria, of course, he has made this declaration and intent very clear. On Afghanistan, we still don't know what exactly American position is about withdrawal. We know that they are going ahead with these negotiations, and the negotiations have perhaps reached a stage where they can declare it publicly. So by and large, it seems to be driven by the domestic political logic of Mr. Trump. But I think in some ways, you do see the appetite for these wars going down in the US significantly over the last few years.
Yeah.
And I think that will have an impact on what sort of policy
and how you
strategy
see Russia now playing a role post United States?
Russia has, for the last, I think, 2 years or so, has been very actively involved in the process. In fact, it has had a parallel peace talks going on, where it was bringing in various stakeholders. And in some ways that reflects its desire to play a larger role in this region. Central Asia it's something that Russia considers very important for its security. And there's been a tension with various other stakeholders, including America and China. So I think by being the first of the bloc, it has sort of shaped the diplomatic space, if you will. But I think it doesn't have the kind of equities that America has in the process, and the pulls and the pressures that America is facing, and the way it can bring all the stakeholders.
And where do you see, Harsh, India is standing in this whole? We did hear about India's sort of presence in Moscow when these talks were on. We did hear about India getting engaged with the United States. How you view the current disposition?
It seems to me that India has been preparing the ground for this for quite some time now. So if you go back to the Wuhan spirit, the first idea on the table was Sino-Indian cooperation in Afghanistan.
That's right.
And that was in part a reflection of this reality that something is going to happen to the American troops.
So do you expect new coalitions coming in
Absolutely.
post-US exit?
I mean, that is a given, because what we are witnessing now is a new configuration of balance of power in the region, and various states will position themselves accordingly.
Sreeram, let me bring you in a larger context. We saw how France intervened in Liberia, how this brought out the key peace process all across Syria and many other conflict-affected countries. Even for Yemen, they came out and couldn't move forward. So my question to you is, how you see these global powers who are interfering in some affairs on some or the other pretext, and then when it comes to exit without doing the full course correction that was required, they move out early. We are seeing this in case of Afghanistan. We saw that in case of Iran. We saw it in Syria, as Harsh very rightly mentioned. We are seeing now in Yemen with what a couple of countries are doing in Yemen. How you view the larger global context of these interventions and the course correction? Eventually the burden, of course, is there on the shoulders of the local people. So instead of strengthening local institutions, we do these forceful interventions. What and how, as an IR expert, you view this?
Well, Harsh, I think the liberal interventionists in the West always believe that they can go and fix the world and shape the world order and create stability wherever they wish. And usually this has come to naught. I mean, it's more like an imperialist fantasy, and often they go in with one set of goals and then they stay on for other reasons. Like, for example, now Trump has let out, in a way, the cat out of the bag. He said, we are not going to leave Iraq because our forces there will help to keep a watch on Iran. So in other words, what happens is a mission creep. This war in Afghanistan is 17 years. Now, Obama called it a war of necessity. Now Trump is calling it a foolish war, and that we must get out of it. So you see, what happens is, administration to administration, most of the Western governments, they develop a vested interest in continuing these things. Even now, Trump is an isolationist and a populist and wants to get out. But within the US system, there are a lot of levers and saying that, we must stay, we must stabilize the region, that kind of. But ultimately, no matter how long they stay, except Japan and Germany after World War II, which were anyway had prior industrial and stability and no ethnic conflict internally, they have not been able to do any nation building in most parts of the world. Rather, we've been saying through our own quiet way, developing countries like India have been helping in nation building of places like Afghanistan much more than the US, because they have a dual role. One is military control and using it for geopolitical power projection in the region, and two, they say we are doing nation building, which leads to a backlash because most people, local people themselves, So, for example, the Taliban, how they have been sustaining for 17 years.
So, how you see, Sreeram, a sort of global discussion and debate on what kind of role countries who are entering in with force, what onus lies with them in terms of ensuring development, and for how long they should remain committed?
You remember, Sachin, some time ago when the responsibility to protect idea was brought out at the international level, the Brazilians said there should be responsibility while protecting, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And their argument was that, the way you intervene and, if you try to build up a new state and if it is not based on the social realities, like Bush administration did that in both countries, they tried to create regimes that did not fit the, previous pre-existing social norms or the political culture of the place, and it was a misfit and it didn't last very long.
So, if we call it right to responsibility, what do you think, which set of countries should initiate this responsibility for ensuring peace along with development and prosperity?
I think,
as an
Sachin,
objective?
it's very clear now with Afghanistan also, as Harsh is saying, the onus is on the regional powers and the neighbors to act responsibly and bring a different type of order there, as opposed to the failed one which the Americans tried for 17 years and could not succeed.
Because the way EU identified specific leaders in Venezuela that we are seeing in case of Africa, so these external extra regional interventions are not proving out to be the most viable.
There's a saying, Sachin, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Initially, the liberal internationalists and interventionists believe that we are going there to fix the world and we have the power to do good in the world and all that, humanitarian intervention, democracy promotion. Trump is opposing all that and saying, I'm going to get out of this. In a way, I think that he is doing a better thing. I'm not supporting the hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan, but his overall view is more realistic that, we cannot fix these problems. Certainly. And we should be moving away from this notion of grandeur and we as somehow some kind of arbiter of the world's destiny.
Harsh, let me bring you back here in terms of the realistic assumption that Sreeram has about Trump's strategy. How you view the global responsibility, because it is not one day affair. Armed forces enter in, they destabilize, as we saw in case of Libya. We saw how France was in such a great haste, and we know what is the state of affairs now. Same we are going to see in Afghanistan. How reliable, in your view, would be Taliban as a faction post-US in this region?
See, I think the whole strategy, it seems to me, is premised somehow on believing what the Taliban are telling their American interlocutors at this stage.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite unrealistic to assume that the strategy of Taliban would remain the same once they see Americans off from Afghanistan. So I think one has to be a bit more realistic in expecting what the Taliban may or may not bring to the table. What I think the Americans are now pushing them towards is to have some kind of a dialogue with the Afghan government, which from an Indian perspective is very, very important, because we have said we want an Afghan-owned, Afghan-led peace process. We want the existing state structures to be preserved. So unless Taliban and the existing state government in Kabul can relate to each other, can have a conversation, can have a dialogue about the future, I think this is not going to work. You will end up in the same situation that was earlier prevalent in Afghanistan: chaos, warlordism, and that would mean that effectively Taliban and the radical forces can then sweep back to power based on what the chaos that they're able to perpetrate. So I think from India's perspective, it is very important that we see the state capacity, whatever it is at the moment, which is very limited, but that needs to be preserved and enhanced. We can't be in a situation where Afghanistan deteriorates and that capacity dissolves in front of our eyes.
So how do you extrapolate that to other regions? The larger question that I raised with Sreeram in terms of countries that are intervening in other regions, how you see their responsibility be fixed? Do you see these exits really a solution? Do you see such interventions really as something that would pave way for solution? Just one quick response.
I don't think. I think there is a realization now in the West that what they have done in the last few decades has actually brought more harm than good. And perhaps because of the weakening of the West, resource-wise, ideologically-wise, perhaps this will pave way for a more balanced international order.
So
Great. On this note,
Tony Blair said,
yeah,
I admit now that the series of
he is the one who is responsible for this, exactly.
So
on this, we would have to stop here for a break. Don't go away. Many more very interesting points would come up. Welcome back. In this section, we bring to you analysis which you do not find in your newspaper columns. We call this Beyond the News. And today we have picked up this very interesting theme of dynamics of 1.5 diplomacy. What role think tanks play? What constitutes 1.5 diplomacy? Let's have a look at this report.
Track 1.5 diplomacy refers to the working together of official and non-official actors to resolve issues and deepen cooperation. Initiated by countries like US and UK, developing countries like India and China have also started to engage think tanks with their respective ministries at the national level for evidence-based policy making and at international level to strengthen cooperation. Think tanks act as curators of knowledge and provide an informal space to governments for the exchange of ideas. Involvement of empirical research coming out of think tank in policy making helps in better decision making by both governments and private sector. Think tanks also play an advocacy role to carry forward the domestic and international commitments of countries, and thus research entails social responsibility and ethical standards to be met. The need for policies backed by empirical research is gaining currency, making the role of think tanks critical in the national and international arena. India has initiated several Track 1.5 processes such as the Delhi Dialogue to enhance India-ASEAN relations and Raisina Dialogue on politico-security relations. Bilaterally, Track 1.5 diplomacy has enhanced cooperation between China and India in areas of science, technology and cybersecurity through the India-China Think Tank Forum. More recently, India has taken initiatives with signing of MOUs between African and Indian think tanks during the visit of South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. At the multilateral level, IPSA and BRICS groupings also have their own tracks facilitating cross-continental discourse on global governance.
So Sreeram, let me begin with you. How you see this dynamics of 1.5 diplomacy, as it is called, on track, and how you see the role that think tanks globally are playing and their versions in our own part of the world?
Well, Sachin, I call this, transnational relations. It transcends the international relations, which are supposed to be just between states and governments. I think with time what has happened is the role of these government affiliated or even purely independent think tanks has risen as feeders of new ideas, new proposals, and to also to test the waters, because sometimes the government cannot directly do it because it's politics and public opinion. There may be a reaction to something drastically new or different, but they can always find out how would others react through this Track 1.5, Track 2. So I find it as a kind of a good sub-formal or informal forum where Chatham House rules, nothing attributed outside. You can always engage, even with, for example, with China, as our report was saying. Usually they are sensitive, right? Like at the top level, you don't know even a single statement can be dissected by opposition, and people say, you are either appeasing them or you are being too hardline. But creative ways of, building consensus and finding ways out of logjam can be done through this format. So I think think tanks, I would add even university to university relations, have now started to pick up and become part of this broader transnational. So states are there, they are still driving forces, but along with them you are finding this
Sreeram,
moment.
are you saying that 1.5 track involves think tanks, research institutions, but it is in larger people-to-people contact in which many other actors also play a role?
Yeah. So, for example, researchers and scholars now, sometimes I find that think tanks, especially in the South-South format, we are also doing joint research, joint publication. RIS, for example, has done many such things. So, when you look at it, when the output comes out, it's more, promoting the larger goal of multilateralism and a multipolar world, which are very dear to us. Now, which can happen only at summit level by top leaders only once a year. But this can be a kind of continuous it's like a permanent secretariat for South-South relations.
Harsh, you have been at King's College. You have seen think tank community in London itself, and then of course in many other parts of the world. Tell me something, how the post-colonial economies have embraced this idea of think tanks. To what extent we have nurtured the institutions, and to what extent, as Sreeram was rightly mentioning, they could imbibe this in the ecosystem. Is it really giving space for empirical based analysis to be part of the policy making process. How you see that connect?
It seems to me that what has happened is that states increasingly are incapable of engaging with the kind of stakeholders that they have on their own. So foreign policy, diplomacy, and interstate relations are no longer about the high end of the spectrum. They are about that, but they are also about much more. So the state capacity is limited to deal with those topics. So what do you do? I think if you need information, if you need empirical research, where do you go to? State does not have the capacity to provide it, and I think increasingly, therefore, we have seen what has happened, for example, in India post 1990s. This plethora of institutions have emerged, both within the government and outside the government.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very healthy interaction taking place between them, amongst them, with other players on the other on the other side of the globe, and that I think paves the way for much sounder policy making than perhaps we are used to in the past.
Sreeram, I think here one point that I think Harsh has raised very rightly is in terms of what kind of heft the non-state actors, and if we put in your wider sort of context of think tanks, academics, but other 1.5 non-state actors, they playing a role even when G2G, the government to government channels are not working. For instance, several times we have seen in the history that there is a face-off between New Delhi and Dhaka. Of course, in last 5 years we have seen very good relationship between the two countries, but I am just picking up a hypothetical example. Think tanks, research institutions, other non-state actors have very good rapport at the people-to-people level. So, is this also recognition of the reality that there is something beyond the governments, which stands with people, and think tanks, research institutions, other communities, industrial chambers, they all represent that larger group?
Yeah, I mean, in the richer countries, especially in Europe and North America, there have been some think tanks that have distinguished themselves by being quite independent of the state, and in the process they have also generated a critique of state policies and all. And often people say that our think tanks in developing countries don't do enough, but I think the ideology is less, because it's not a liberal kind of, we are in a kind of a post-colonial world where we don't want our states to be weakened and to be somehow run down. Therefore, I think our ideology has been to go along with the state, but also offer new ideas, and that is where I think the university and the academia and the think tanks can go beyond the state agenda and come up with something
One
new.
point that in the earlier intervention you mentioned was in terms of affiliation of think tanks and the purposes they bring on table. How you see this controversy which had was brought out by one of the newspapers from New York about a think tank in the US itself and the motives behind oil pricing, etc. How you see those kind of policy inputs driving specific agenda to be driven by some think tanks for specific houses?
So you are right, there is also a corporate agenda in the rich countries where they support think tanks, and they sometimes go against public interest and come up with the so-called expertise. In fact, that's the reason why we are seeing so much populism and opposition to experts. There is a whole rejection of experts and expertocracy, because they think that this is a liberal conspiracy against the interests of the public, of the general public. So think tanks must be wary of that, because their stakeholders are not only partners in other countries or the government or corporates, but ultimately it should be in the public interest.
We would have to stop here for the book of the week. And this week we have picked up this very interesting book by Ambassador Abdali on the triangle of Pakistan, Afghanistan and India. How you look at this triangle moving towards regional stability. And Harsh, what's your quick comment on the book?
Well, I think this is an area which perhaps if you are looking at Afghanistan, you cannot really get out of. So I think, and Mr. Abdali has played such an important role in this triangle in his own way. So I think it's a very important contribution in terms of a policymaker's understanding of this triangle. Academically we understand it, but I think those who serve on the ground operationally, from their perspective, what are the challenges of navigating this terrain? And being an Afghan official, policymaker, I think his insights into how Afghanistan has been able to manage this in the last 2 decades especially, I think they're quite insightful.
Sreeram, in this book they have also listed the attacks since 2014. They have given rich statistics in terms of how much development assistance has come in, what kind of development projects they have launched, but largely the book captures the political nuances of regional equations, role of extra-regional actors. What do you see coming out of the post-US scenario in light of this book?
Well, I think what Abdal is saying, that Pakistan must be restrained from some of its nefarious, intervention in Afghanistan, and at the same time, India's role is like very central for stabilizing a moderate, democratic Afghanistan. But what he's saying is that ultimately the three have to work together. So, for example, now with the US withdrawal, we are talking only about India partnering with China or with Russia, with Iran. We have not yet reached the stage where we can have a direct understanding with the Pakistanis to stop the so-called proxy war in Afghanistan. But that's what they want. From the Afghan point of view, no proxy war by any parties, because that is how they can become a crossroads for global trade and commerce between South Asia, Central Asia. So that vision of Hamid Karzai, former president, has written the foreword of the book. That is the liberal vision that he's presenting, and he's saying we can do a joint counter-terrorism mechanism where the Pakistanis and the Indians both support Afghanistan. But right now he's very clear-eyed about it, that the Pakistanis are not ready to leave the destructive role, and that is, I think, the hope, for the future.
Exactly. So, trade, commerce, connectivity between the three, US after leaving probably would pave way for China's role and India's partnership with China, and of course we can hope Pakistan to play a more positive role in the region. With that, we close this episode and we look forward for your comments and ideas. We would come back to you next week. Till then, a very goodbye. Thank you.